The town of Bellmare moved like a clock, whose hands had been slowed by rust. Located deep in Vermont, it was the kind of place people drove through on their way to somewhere else. Life here followed a familiar rhythm. Morning coffee brewed by 6, the post office shut by 4, and on Saturdays the faithful few gathered at the town's only theater. The Maplewood Playhouse had stood in the same spot since 1928. Its bricks had darkened with age and ivy had crept into the cracks like it was reclaiming something once stolen. By 1979, most townspeople considered the theater a relic. Some believed it would collapse in the next snowfall. Yet, that summer, a new poster appeared on the notice board by the library. Its design was stark. Black background, white text, no images. One night only. June 30th, The Eyes That Watch. No cast list, no explanation. The director was listed as Thomas Greaves. The writer was Sam Delaney. No one could remember when Maplewood last premiered an original production. Some said the poster gave them a strange feeling, but others dismissed it. Curiosity, not fear, filled the seats that night. The auditorium was small, barely holding 100, but every seat was taken. Folding chairs had been placed in the back and along the aisles. Teenagers sat cross-legged near the stage, giggling and nudging one another. The air buzzed with heat and the scent of old velvet. Evelyn Brooks stepped into the center light. She was known around town for her quiet elegance, the kind of woman who always seemed to know something you did not. Her voice rang out calm and steady. She began the first monologue. It was unlike anything Bellmare had seen. The play explored themes of watching and being watched, of voices echoing in silence, and choices made too late. Characters entered and exited without warning. There was no clear plot. The audience tried to follow, but found themselves pulled into something that felt less like a story and more like a confession. In one scene, a character removed their mask and stared directly into the crowd for nearly a minute. No music, no movement, just stillness. During the second act, the crowd quieted completely. Whispers faded. Even the coughs stopped. It was as if the play had drawn all energy from the room. The scenes were tense and fragmented. A door opened and closed without anyone entering. A prop mirror reflected no one's face. In the final scene, all 10 cast members stood in a straight line facing the audience. They held hands, not speaking, for almost 2 minutes. Then the lights went out. The applause was hesitant at first, then scattered. Some stood expecting a curtain call, but none came. The house lights flickered, then steadied. The stage was empty. An usher appeared at the side door, asking the crowd to exit calmly. People left murmuring to one another. "That was intense," someone said. Others agreed, assuming it was all part of an artistic trick. But by morning, concern replaced curiosity. Phones rang unanswered. Evelyn's porch light remained on her car unmoved. Thomas's mailbox overflowed. Sam's window above the bakery stayed dark. By noon, rumors had begun. Had they left town? Was it a statement, a hoax? The police were called but found no signs of struggle. The theater doors were locked from the inside. A janitor named Ray Miller claimed he had entered through a side door that morning. He said backstage smelled of bleach. He also claimed he saw red smears on the dressing room floor. Not paint, he insisted. Blood. But Ray had a history of nervous complaints. People dismissed him. He was told to get rest. Nothing was reported. The play had been fictional. So, too, it seemed, was any sense of urgency. Weeks passed. Theories took root. Some believed the cast had retreated for a private retreat. Others spoke of ritual or sacrifice, their whispers growing more dramatic as facts became scarce. The building was declared unsafe due to structural issues. It was locked, boarded, and left untouched. A sign was nailed to the front doors warning of mold. Thomas Greaves's name faded from community talk. Evelyn's apartment was rented to a teacher from out of town. Sam's last known relative, a cousin in New Hampshire, never came to claim his belongings. Time, as it always does, buried questions with silence. Yet the legend lived. Teenagers dared each other to touch the rusted stage doors. A group of high school students once sneaked inside on a dare, reporting cold spots and strange whispers. No one believed them. Others claimed to see figures in the windows late at night. But by 1984, the town had mostly moved on. A proposal to convert the site into a town library failed. No one wanted to disturb the building. Some things people reasoned should stay quiet. In the spring of 2024, the silence broke. A national grocery chain purchased the property. Plans for demolition were announced. Locals protested quietly but did not organize. Too much time had passed. The site was fenced. A demolition crew arrived in April. Work began inside. Dust filled the air. Floorboards were torn up. In the basement, behind a false panel near the old lighting controls, a worker discovered a small tin box. It was wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax. Inside were pages, yellowed, curled, but intact. It was a script. The title page read, "The Eyes That Watch." The author's name was Sam Delaney, but it was different. The ending was changed. Characters had new names. Margins were filled with corrections. And on the last page, scrawled in blue ink, was a note. It read, "We should never have changed the final scene." Word of the discovery spread quickly. The box was taken by the project foreman and locked in his truck. That night, he drove it to his home in Rutland. By morning, he called in sick. The project stalled for a week, then 2. He refused to return to the site. He left a voicemail saying the script made no sense, that he could not sleep, that he felt watched. His co-workers dismissed it. But the town remembered the night the play premiered. And now, for the first time in 45 years, there was a new piece to a puzzle no one had finished assembling. Some believed it was a hoax, others were not so sure. But everyone agreed on one thing: the story was not over. The man who found the box under the theater floor was named Dennis Kincaid. He had worked construction most of his life, nothing fancy, mostly commercial teardowns and concrete pours. He was not the kind of person who rattled easily. But after discovering the script and reading just a few lines, something shifted in his behavior. His crew noticed the change almost immediately. He stopped eating lunch with them. He stared into empty corners of the site longer than anyone else found normal. When asked what was wrong, he mumbled that some words should stay buried. The crew shrugged it off until the morning he failed to show up. The foreman went to check on him and found Dennis in his truck, sleeping with the pages of the play clutched in his lap. He woke up angry and confused, refusing to let anyone touch the box. That afternoon, he quit the job entirely, leaving the site in silence. The remaining workers were told to avoid the basement and focus on dismantling the front lobby. The script, however, had already made its way into a new pair of hands. The box was taken to the town clerk's office, where a junior administrator named Lila Marin was tasked with archiving any historical items found during demolition. Lila had moved to Bellmare only 2 years earlier, following a divorce and a change of pace. She had no attachment to the theater or the stories around it. When she opened the box and unfolded the script, her first reaction was curiosity. She had studied literature in college and was struck by the richness of the dialogue. But as she flipped through the pages, she noticed something else. Several sheets were out of order. Others were missing entirely. In the margins of Act 2, a different handwriting had scribbled strange notations. Some lines were underlined repeatedly. One scene heavily crossed out had a name written in pencil above it. The name was Thomas Greaves. At the bottom of the page, someone had drawn an arrow pointing to the phrase, "We are not actors, we are witnesses." Lila contacted the town's historical society, but their records on Maplewood were minimal. Most files had been lost in the 1986 fire. There was no floor plan, no list of shows produced after 1975, no mention of the eyes that watch. She decided to check the town library instead. Tucked between outdated road atlases and brittle town census records, she found a single folder labeled Theater Correspondence, 1979. Inside was a letter addressed to the town council from Sam Delaney. It was dated 2 weeks before the show. In it, he expressed concern over last-minute script changes. He stated that Thomas Greaves had insisted on rewriting the final act without his consent. Sam claimed the new version undermined the play's purpose and inserted what he called dangerous theatrical devices. He closed the letter by warning that performance without truth was not just dishonest but destructive. The signature was smudged, but the tone was unmistakable. Sam had not approved the final version. As Lila continued her research, she stumbled across a name she did not recognize: Marie Ellison. Listed as an understudy in the playbill for the June 30th performance, her name had never appeared in any of the rumors or folklore about the disappearance. A quick search revealed that Marie had been 19 at the time and lived in a small apartment above a laundromat near the edge of town. The building still stood. With growing unease, Lila visited the address and knocked on the door. The current tenant, a man in his 50s, said the unit had been vacant for decades before he moved in. He had found a locked trunk in the closet when he first arrived, but never opened it. With his permission, Lila took the trunk to the historical office. It was old and rusted, the kind used for costumes or sheet music. Inside, she found a faded green notebook, several yellowed playbills, and a torn sheet labeled Revised Ledger. It was a cast list. 10 names were typed out. 9 had been crossed out in red ink. 1 remained, Marie Ellison. The next morning, Lila drove to Rutland to visit the county registrar's office. There, she discovered that Marie had moved away just a few months after the play. No forwarding address, no marriage certificate, no record of death. But in 1992, a person named M. Ellison had filed a name change request in Albany, New York. The new name was marked confidential. Lila requested the record, citing historical research. The clerk hesitated but finally gave her the information. The new name was Miriam Ellis. She lived just outside of Albany in a quiet neighborhood near the outskirts of town. The address was current. Lila did not call ahead. She made the drive on impulse, heart pounding as she pulled into the driveway of a modest, single-story home. The yard was well kept. A mailbox read Ellis in faded gold letters. She approached the front porch and knocked twice. A long pause followed. Then the door opened slightly. A woman in her 60s peered out. Her face was familiar, older, worn, but unmistakable. Lila introduced herself and explained her reason for coming. The woman listened silently. Then she opened the door wider and nodded. She said she would talk, but only once. They sat at the kitchen table. Miriam Ellis poured tea but did not drink any herself. She confirmed that she had once gone by Marie Ellison. She said she had been part of the Maplewood cast but had fallen ill the day of the performance and never made it to the theater. She claimed Thomas Greaves had insisted she stay home. She watched the show's opening night from her bedroom window, listening to the sounds echoing across the town. She had not spoken to any of the other cast members since that day. They had all vanished. She believed they were dead. When asked why she had never come forward, she said simply that she had been afraid. Afraid of the truth, afraid of what the play had become. The next few days passed in a slow, persistent haze for Lila. She replayed Miriam Ellis's words in her head, especially the way she had said afraid of what the play had become. Miriam had not gone into detail, but something in her tone implied more than stage fright or personal guilt. Lila returned to Bellmare with more questions than answers. She placed the notebook, the ledger, and a photocopy of Sam Delaney's letter in a locked drawer at the town office. She spent that evening reading the original script again, this time paying closer attention to the revisions in the margins. Some of the handwritten changes were familiar. Others had a different slant, as though another voice had begun steering the narrative toward a darker tone. Certain lines were crossed out and replaced with monologues about sacrifice, permanence, and identity. One scene, originally titled Confession, had been renamed Witness. Lila began to suspect that the changes were not just artistic decisions. They felt more like instructions, as if someone had turned the script into a ritual. She decided to find someone who had known Sam Delaney personally. His name had faded from town memory, but a few older residents recalled that he had a brother who moved to upstate New York in the early 80s. After 3 days of phone calls and emails, she finally got a response. Paul Delaney, 71 years old, living in a small house in Saranac Lake, agreed to speak with her. Lila drove out the next morning, bringing with her copies of the script and Marie's notebook. Paul met her at the door with cautious eyes. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. Inside his living room was simple but filled with books. He asked her what she wanted to know. She told him everything, including what Miriam had said. Paul nodded slowly, then reached for a thin folder tucked inside a bookshelf behind the couch. He said Sam had sent him something just before he disappeared. The folder contained a typed manuscript, an early draft of The Eyes That Watch. Paul said it had been mailed in May of 1979, along with a brief note. In the note, Sam had written that the play was changing faster than he could control it. He feared it no longer belonged to him. He warned that Thomas Greaves had begun rewriting scenes with an obsession that made Sam uneasy. Sam wrote that he was scared the performance would become something irreversible. The manuscript confirmed what Lila suspected. The final act in Sam's version was entirely different. It ended with the cast leaving the stage and removing their costumes in silence. There was no ritual, no monologue, no ominous final stare. The final stage direction read quietly, "They walk into the dark." In Thomas's version, however, the actors remained on stage linking hands and delivering a line that did not exist in the original script. "We know what you are." Paul admitted that he and Sam had grown apart in those years. Sam had withdrawn, avoided phone calls, and stopped visiting family altogether. Paul had assumed he was lost in work or suffering another bout of depression. But the arrival of that final manuscript had disturbed him. He had read it once and never looked at it again until now. He told Lila that Sam had always been intense but never unstable. The last time they spoke, Sam had said something strange. He told Paul that theater was no longer about stories but about consequences. Paul had not understood it then. Now, after hearing Lila's discoveries, he was no longer sure what to believe. On the drive back, Lila kept her eyes fixed on the road, her mind churning with possibilities. She now had two versions of the same play, each pulling the story in different directions. She had testimony from the one surviving member of the cast, and she had Sam's final letter. Yet nothing concrete explained what happened the night the cast vanished. When she arrived home, she placed the early manuscript beside the revised script and began cataloging the differences line by line. At 3 a.m, she paused on a phrase that appeared only in Thomas's version. It was spoken by a secondary character and seemed innocuous at first. "We return to where we are named." The line did not appear in any earlier draft. She had searched through Marie's notebook and found it scrawled in the margin beside a rehearsal date, repeated 3 times. "We return to where we are named." She did not understand its meaning, but it made her skin prickle. The following afternoon, Lila returned to the theater site. Demolition had resumed, but only on the upper levels. The basement was still closed off. She asked the site manager if she could retrieve a box of documents left in a side office. He hesitated, but allowed her in under supervision. While inside, she moved quickly, scanning the walls and floor for anything unusual. In the rear corner of the basement, behind a partially removed support beam, she noticed a discoloration on the brick. It looked like a seam. With a flashlight and a bit of pressure, she uncovered a small cavity in the wall. Inside was a metal filing box, long forgotten. She opened it and found several typed pages, a checklist, and a ledger with the words "Production Timeline" scrawled on the front. The checklist included dates, actor initials, and handwritten notes such as "Rehearsal, completed replacement needed, and final version approved." One line, dated 2 days before the show, read, "Sam removed. Role, reassigned." The handwriting was not Sam's. Lila brought the ledger home and scanned each page into her laptop. She enlarged the signatures and compared them to known samples. The annotations matched the handwriting found in the revised script. Thomas Greaves had removed Sam from the final process. It was not an accident or misunderstanding. Sam had been deliberately cut out. But the strangest entry came last. It was dated July 2nd, 2 days after the performance. The line read, "Archive sealed. Silence confirmed." Beneath it was a single letter. The next few mornings were quiet but restless for Lila. Her thoughts turned often to the final line in the ledger she had found. Archive sealed. Silence confirmed. The letter S beneath it raised questions she could not yet answer. Had Sam somehow sealed something after the performance, or was that an initial belonging to someone else entirely? She felt a mounting sense of urgency, a pressure she could not name. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed that each discovery was part of something designed to stay hidden. She decided to return to the Public Records Center this time, looking not for documents, but for film. During her earlier visit to the town library, she had noticed an old cabinet marked AV Reels. She had dismissed it at the time, assuming it held outdated news footage or public event recordings. But now she wondered if anything had been captured during the theater's final years. The cabinet sat in the back of the archive room, covered in dust and sealed with a rusted latch. Lila pried it open and coughed as a cloud of dust lifted from the shelves. The reels were stacked neatly, most labeled with masking tape and shaky handwriting. Christmas Parade 1977, Town Hall Meeting 1978. But one box was different. It was heavier than the others and unlabeled except for a faded tag with the words Projection Copy A scrawled on it. Curious, Lila checked the index catalog nearby and found no mention of Projection Copy A. With care, she placed the reel in her canvas bag and drove across town to Bellmare High School, where the old AV equipment was still kept in the drama department's storage room. The school's janitor, who remembered her from a previous visit, unlocked the door and let her in. Inside, Lila found an old 16mm projector and began threading the film carefully. The film was grainy and shaky, clearly recorded from the back of the auditorium, likely by a fixed camera mounted for training or archival purposes. The footage began with audience members settling into their seats. The date stamp in the corner read 06/30/79. It was the night of the performance. Lila leaned forward as the lights dimmed on screen. The first scene played out just as she remembered from the script. Evelyn Brooks walked on stage and delivered her opening monologue. The camera remained still. Everything seemed ordinary until the second act. One by one, the cast took the stage for individual scenes, but something felt off. The timing was slower than the script described. The actors looked hesitant, almost reluctant. At several points, Thomas Greaves could be seen off stage pacing just behind the curtain, his silhouette visible through the thin fabric. Then, something happened that made Lila stop breathing for a moment. Near the end of the second act, as the lights dimmed between scenes, a figure appeared backstage in a long coat. The figure did not match any of the cast members based on her research. He stood near the rear door for several seconds, then walked into the shadows. The film continued. In the final act, the cast formed their line at the front of the stage, holding hands in silence. They stared forward. Then the lights cut. The screen turned black, but the reel kept spinning. After nearly 2 minutes of silence, the picture returned. The camera was still running. The auditorium was empty, no audience remained. On stage, the cast was gone, but a single chair sat in the middle of the spotlight. Someone had placed the original script on the seat. Lila felt a chill crawl down her spine. She rewound the reel and watched again. Nothing changed. It was all there, but none of it made sense. She returned home and spent the night rewatching the footage frame by frame. At 1:47:12, just before the lights cut, she paused the screen. On the far right of the stage, Evelyn Brooks turned her head slightly, as if reacting to something or someone in the wings. Her expression changed from focus to fear. Lila captured the frame and printed it. She stared at Evelyn's eyes. They were not acting. They were watching something wrong. She dug through the script again, matching it line by line with the film. Every change Thomas had made appeared in the performance. Nothing from Sam's original ending remained. The final phrase spoken by the cast, "We know what you are," had been delivered with strange intensity. Lila now believed it was directed not at the audience, but at someone specific behind the curtain. The next day, Lila contacted the Bellmare Historical Society and asked for any records of guests or special attendees listed for the June 30th performance. After 2 hours, a clerk returned her call with a short list. Most were locals. One name stood out, Raymond Hollis, a former state cultural affairs director, had been seated in the front row. His presence had not been mentioned in any press clippings. Further research revealed that Hollis had been active in securing arts grants during the 1970s, including funds for independent theater programs across New England. He had disappeared from public life in the early 1980s. Some records listed him as retired. Others made no mention of him at all after 1982. Lila tracked down a former assistant of Hollis, a man named Walter Henshaw, now living in Barr. When contacted, he agreed to meet her at a cafe just outside town. Walter was in his 80s and walked with a cane, but his eyes were sharp. When she mentioned Maplewood Playhouse, he grew quiet. She asked about the performance in 1979. He nodded slowly and said he had accompanied Hollis to Bellmare that night. He remembered the play, but not the ending. He said Hollis had seemed agitated during the performance, and that afterward he insisted they leave immediately. He also recalled that Hollis had made a phone call from a payphone across the street before they departed. Walter had never asked about it again. Lila thanked him and returned home feeling the weight of something just beyond her reach. She opened her laptop and compiled the timeline. A rewritten play, a vanished cast, a hidden film, a guest who never returned to public life, a playwright who warned of consequences. She opened the last folder she had scanned. It was a photocopy of Sam's margin notes. In the top corner of one page, written in pencil, were the words, "Vault 1 must remain sealed." She did not know what Vault 1 was, but she intended to find out. Lila began her next steps by returning to the floor plans of Maplewood Playhouse. The original blueprints had burned in the county archive fire of 1986, but she managed to locate a hand-drawn emergency evacuation map from 1978, tucked inside a dusty fire department binder stored in the back of the town's maintenance garage. The map showed 2 exits, a lobby, a ticket booth, the main hall, and a backstage area. But just below the labeled storage room was a faint marking. A short corridor had been sketched in pencil, ending in a space labeled simply V1. Her pulse quickened. Vault 1. It had been there all along. The corridor was not listed on any of the public documents, and the door had likely been hidden behind stage props or temporary walls. She made a photocopy and circled the area. She then called the demolition team lead and requested access to the lower level, citing historical preservation interests. She offered no other explanation, but her request was reluctantly approved for a 2-hour window the following morning. She arrived at the site early, wearing boots and gloves, and entered the basement through a rusted stairwell near the orchestra pit. Dust clung to the air like smoke. The structure creaked with every step. Following the map, she located the corridor behind a collapsed section of wall. It was narrower than she expected and lined with cracked plaster. At the end, a rusted metal door stood slightly ajar. The hinges squealed when she'd pushed it open. Inside the room was dark and rectangular, with crumbling chairs against the wall and a single table at its center. On the far side was a shelving unit with a locked metal box bolted to the frame. The box was labeled simply Ledger B. Lila took photographs and scanned the room with her flashlight eyes drawn to a torn poster pinned to the wall. It was an early draft of The Eyes That Watch, with a red line drawn across its title. Beneath it, someone had scrawled, "Leave nothing unfinished." She returned later that day with a locksmith. The lock was old, but cracked open within minutes. Inside the metal box were a stack of folders, a dusty audio tape, and a Polaroid photo showing the cast in costume standing in front of the theater's back wall. Lila froze. Behind the cast in the photo, just above their heads, a faint symbol had been drawn in chalk. It resembled a set of concentric circles, the innermost one marked with a single line cutting through it. She remembered seeing the same symbol drawn in pencil in the corner of Sam's notes. She added the photo to her folder and then turned her attention to the audio tape. There was no label. She borrowed an old cassette player from the library and hit play. The recording began with low static, then the sound of chairs scraping and muffled voices. It was a rehearsal. Thomas Greaves could be heard directing the cast, his voice calm but forceful. He gave notes, paused repeated lines. Then about 30 minutes in, the tone shifted. His voice grew sharper, more insistent. He told the cast to stop reciting and start surrendering. Evelyn asked a question, but he cut her off. He said the performance had to be real. There was no other way. Sam's voice appeared once soft and hesitant. He asked Thomas what he meant. Thomas replied, "You know what we agreed to." After that, there was a silence that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Then the tape ended with a line spoken by Evelyn. "If this is truth, I do not want to know it." That night, Lila sat in her apartment surrounded by photocopies, scribbled notes, and audio transcripts. She began to piece together a timeline of the final week before the performance. She created a chart with every known rehearsal, every script change, every missing page. She marked the moment Sam was removed. She marked when the ledger labeled Ledger B was hidden in Vault 1. She compared the handwriting from the ledger with the notes Thomas left in the final script. They matched. Then she looked again at the list of actors. A name stood out. Peter Mather. He had played a minor role, one of the last to join the troupe. There had been almost no mention of him in any records. No obituary, no family statements. She searched online and found a single article from 1979, a short paragraph noting Peter's arrival from Hartford just months before the production. No other record of his departure existed. His name had never appeared in Bellmare again. It was as if he had stepped onto the stage and vanished. Lila followed the lead to Hartford. After contacting the State College Theater Department, where Peter had briefly studied, she discovered that one of his former classmates was now a professor there. His name was Michael Trent. She reached out and arranged a call. Michael remembered Peter as quiet, intensely focused, and very selective with his friendships. He said Peter had spoken once about Bellmare, calling it a place where something honest was happening. Michael said Peter sent one final letter after the show in 1979. The letter had no return address. In it, Peter wrote, "I have seen the thing behind the script, and I have let it see me too." Michael never heard from him again. Lila asked if he still had the letter. He said he had kept it all these years. She asked him to read it aloud. It was brief and strange. The final line said, "When the performance ends, they do not leave the stage. They remain inside the story waiting for someone to see it again." Michael had assumed it was poetry. Now he was not so sure. He agreed to send Lila a copy. She thanked him and ended the call. Returning to her notes, Lila circled the phrase "waiting for someone to see it again." The entire structure of the production, the vanished cast, the symbol, the altered script, it all pointed to something unfinished. It was not just a disappearance, it was a cycle, a loop waiting to begin again. The following morning, Lila awoke with a deeper sense of resolve than she had felt in weeks, the kind that settled in her chest like weight rather than excitement. She had spent the night reviewing the letter sent by Peter Mather to his classmate, and although the lines were poetic in tone, the content disturbed her more the longer she read it. She found herself returning to one sentence in particular, the claim that the actors remained inside the story, waiting for someone to see it again. The implication was not metaphorical, it was deliberate. It suggested that the performance had not ended with applause, that its echoes continued somewhere unseen, and that whoever reopened the script would unknowingly become part of that continuation. That morning, with the town's streets still quiet and dew clinging to the leaves, she made her way to the local records office, intent on uncovering anything that might explain how the town had responded to the cast's disappearance in the days that followed the performance. Inside the building, Lila requested access to the 1979 council meeting transcripts. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with sharp reading glasses and a protective attitude towards public documents, led her to a rear room where the older files were stored in metal cabinets. As Lila sifted through the dusty folders, her fingers landed on a file labeled July 1979 Incident Reports. Inside were typed pages yellowed by time and marginal notes written in red ink. One entry described a reported fire at the Bellmare Historical Society just 3 days after the play. The fire had apparently destroyed a room containing archival donations, including scripts programs and several ledgers related to local performing arts events. The report concluded with the phrase, "Cause undetermined." Another page dated 2 days later described the resignation of a council member who had allegedly voiced concerns about the town's handling of the incident. His resignation letter was included, but had been heavily redacted with entire paragraphs blacked out in thick marker. It was the only document in the folder with visible signs of censorship. When Lila asked the clerk if there had ever been an investigation into the fire, the woman gave her a long look before replying that no formal inquiry had ever been opened. The building had been deemed structurally unstable after the incident, and no further documentation had been pursued. Lila pressed gently, asking whether anyone from the council at that time might still be living in town. The clerk hesitated, then gave her a name. Frances Melrose, former council chair, now in a retirement home just outside of Bellmare. Without waiting another day, Lila drove to the facility and requested a visit. Francis, now in his 80s, agreed to speak with her once she mentioned the Maplewood Playhouse. His posture was frail, and his eyes seemed heavy with memory, but he remained alert and clear. When she asked about the fire, his expression changed subtly, as though something dormant had stirred within him. Francis told her that the fire had not been random. He remembered receiving a phone call the morning it happened, warning him that a file labeled Ledger needed to be removed from the building before it was too late. The voice on the phone had been calm but firm, and he recognized it as Thomas Greaves. Francis had ignored the call, at first thinking it was a dramatization. But hours later, the fire started in the very room where the ledgers were stored. Firefighters had contained it quickly, but the damage to the documents was extensive. The only item recovered intact was a scorched file containing a list of donations and a ledger summary marked confidential. That summary, Francis recalled, had referenced something called Project Overture. He remembered Thomas using that phrase during a presentation to the town council months earlier, claiming that the performance was part of a cultural experiment funded through discretionary state grants. At the time, the council had dismissed his language as theatrical exaggeration. Lila asked Francis whether any part of Project Overture had been documented in council records. He nodded slowly and said it had been mentioned only once, in meeting minutes, then removed upon request. He believed the removal had been prompted by an outside official. When she mentioned Raymond Hollis, Francis's eyes narrowed. He confirmed that Hollis had been present at the June performance and had spoken privately with Thomas after the show. The next morning, Francis found a memo on his desk instructing the council to remain silent about the performance and to cancel any further programming at Maplewood Playhouse. When he questioned the memo, he received a second letter from the State Arts Department stating that Bellmare had been placed on temporary funding suspension. It was clear that silence was not optional. Francis told her he regretted his compliance, but had felt powerless to resist. Armed with the new name, Project Overture, Lila returned home and began a digital search across newspaper archives, university records, and state grant filings. The term yielded almost nothing until she reached a private university database in New Hampshire, where a 1978 newsletter referenced a symposium on experimental performance theory hosted by the Northeast Institute for Arts and Public Memory. The guest speaker listed was Thomas Greaves. The topic of his talk had been retaining narrative through real-time presence. Lila printed the page and underlined every relevant phrase. She then searched the Institute's current site and found that it had been absorbed into a larger foundation in the early 1990s, with most of its research files donated to a regional university. She placed a call requesting access and arranged to visit the archive within the week. As she prepared her notes and reviewed her findings that night, Lila returned to one document she had nearly overlooked. It was a donation ledger from the burned archive, one of the few surviving documents. The list included names, item descriptions, and conditions. One line dated June 27, 1979, stated the following performance wardrobe stage notes and ledger, A submitted by T. Greaves. Another line beneath it, dated July 2nd, read withdrawal approved. File removed by R. Hollis. That entry had been stamped with the word final in bold black ink. She stared at the paper until the lines blurred. Everything connected now, in fragments, names reappearing at crucial moments. documents destroyed or hidden, a rehearsal twisted into something more than performance. She wrote a single sentence in her notebook before closing it for the night. The script was never meant to be art, it was meant to be instruction. Lila arrived at the University Archive Center just after noon, the sky heavy with low gray clouds and the air weighted with the scent of distant rain. The building itself was a modern addition to the older brick campus, all glass walls and automatic doors that opened too slowly. Inside, a graduate assistant led her to a quiet reading room where a box labeled Northeast Institute for Arts and Public Memory sat waiting. It had been retrieved from cold storage and the tape seal had just been cut that morning. Lila pulled on the provided gloves and lifted the lid, revealing layers of typed papers, program brochures, and handwritten correspondence. She quickly identified a folder labeled Symposium 1978, the same event where Thomas Greaves had presented his talk. The contents were fragmented but telling. There were notes from attendees, typed outlines from other panelists, and one long transcript of Greaves's lecture. As she read through it, her hand went cold. Thomas spoke at length about the boundary between audience and performer, but more disturbingly, he discussed erasure and permanence as tools of emotional design. He argued that if an actor disappears from the life they performed, their character outlives the self. He called this transformation necessary for what he described as total narrative containment. On the final page of his transcript, he quoted a line not present in any known draft of the play, "Let the story seal us so we do not fade." It became clear to Lila that the 1979 production had not been the end goal, but a demonstration of something larger, something rehearsed under academic justification and cloaked in performance theory. She photocopied everything and took detailed notes before thanking the archivist and making her way out just as rain began to fall. By the time she returned to Bellmare, evening had taken hold. The streets were slick, and the theater site stood dark behind its chain-link fence, now partially collapsed from weather and time. Her plan had not yet taken full form, but she felt herself circling something that demanded exposure. That night, while reviewing her notes, she received a call from the site foreman. 2 hikers had wandered past the fence while walking their dog near the woods behind the theater and stumbled into a soft section of ground near a drainage pipe. What they had found had stopped them cold. Lila drove out immediately, flashlight in hand, mud pulling at her boots with every step. Near the base of the collapsed hill behind the stage foundation, a shallow depression had opened in the earth. At the bottom of it, half buried in rotted wood and crumbling insulation, was a metal box caked with rust. It had broken open in the fall, its contents spilling into the wet ground. Lila knelt and used a gloved hand to lift a bundle of papers wrapped in what looked like cloth. Only when she turned it did she realize it was not cloth at all, but the remains of a costume, one of the black capes worn by the cast during the final act. The fabric was stiff with age and stained deep maroon in places that had dried unevenly. She held the bundle close and walked it back to the temporary trailer used as the foreman's office. Under the light of the desk lamp, she slowly peeled apart the damp pages. It was a script hand-bound with string nearly identical to the original production notes, but covered in handwritten additions and scratches. Most pages were smudged and faded, but the last 5 were still legible. On the back of the final page, someone had written a message in blue ink. It read, "Only one of us lived." It was signed with initials, E.B. Evelyn Brooks. Lila did not speak for nearly a minute. She stared at the handwriting, comparing it with letters from the town archive. The looped B and the shape of the lowercase e confirmed what she feared. The message was real. Evelyn had survived. The discovery shifted everything. Lila contacted the regional crime lab and submitted the script for analysis, requesting expedited results on the stains and handwriting. While she waited, she followed every lead she could find connected to Evelyn Brooks's life after 1979. No obituary existed. Her apartment had been rented out by 1980, and her bank records ended the same year. But one clue came from a property deed in New Hampshire purchased under the name Elaine Booker in 1981. The woman listed was born in Vermont and had no prior credit history. Lila compared the photo from the license application with the cast photo from Maplewood. The jawline, the eyes, the sloped shoulders. It was Evelyn, or at least the woman Evelyn had become. Lila drove to the town of Ashby, where the house listed under Elaine Booker still stood. It was a small gray home at the edge of a wooded lot far from neighbors and partially obscured by untrimmed hedges. She approached the door with caution, her heart loud in her chest. When she knocked, no one answered. She waited, then knocked again, this time with a firmer rhythm. After a moment, a light flicked on in the hallway and the door cracked open. A woman in her 70s peered out, her expression unreadable. Lila introduced herself and explained she was conducting historical research on the Maplewood Playhouse. The woman remained silent, then stepped back and allowed Lila inside. The living room was sparsely decorated. Bookshelves lined the walls, but there were no photographs. The woman sat in a wooden chair near the window and gestured for Lila to speak. Lila asked her if she had once been Evelyn Brooks. The woman's face did not change, but her eyes closed briefly. Then she nodded. Lila told her about the discovery of the blood-stained script, the message, the initials. Evelyn said very little at first. Then she stood and walked slowly to a side drawer where she pulled out a folder thick with handwritten pages. She handed them to Lila and said she had written everything down because she knew one day someone would come asking. The following morning, Lila sat in the quiet of her small office surrounded by stacks of printed transcripts, photos, and the fragile folder Evelyn had entrusted to her. The rain from the night before had left streaks on her window pane, and the gray light filtered through like a memory she could not quite place. She had not slept, not truly, but her mind felt sharper than it had in weeks. Every piece of the narrative Evelyn had written rested in her hands, and though the words were measured and careful, they left little room for doubt. These were not the ramblings of someone lost in memory or grief. Each page detailed a sequence of rehearsals, interactions, and subtle shifts in the behavior of the cast and crew that had piece by piece led them toward something that had never been intended to be just a performance. According to Evelyn's journal, the final rehearsals had taken on a tone that none of the cast fully understood at the time. Thomas Greaves had insisted that they meet late in the evenings, sometimes even past midnight, and not on the main stage, but in a smaller unfinished section of the basement that none of them had ever entered before. This space, which Thomas referred to as the undiscovered stage, had no documented blueprints or mentions in the building's known layout, but Evelyn described it in precise detail. The room was narrow and dim, with black drapes pinned along the walls, and a set of mismatched chairs arranged around a central table. The air, she wrote, felt dense, as though it had not been touched by breath in decades. The floor creaked in unnatural rhythms, and the lighting had no visible source. Yet the room remained dimly lit throughout the rehearsals without any lamps or visible bulbs. Evelyn stated that on the final evening before the performance, Thomas distributed a new version of the script, one that had not been reviewed or approved by Sam Delaney. This version, bound in black cloth and labeled Version Omega, contained new pages that none of the actors had seen before, including handwritten instructions instead of dialogue for the final scene. The final line of this script did not belong to any character. Instead, it directed the cast to remain present until the audience had seen everything. Evelyn admitted in her writing that she did not fully understand what this meant at the time, but the tone in Thomas's voice when he issued the direction gave her a chill that remained with her long after she left that room. As the performance began on June 30th, Evelyn noted that the air inside the Maplewood Playhouse felt unnaturally still. The cast moved through their cues with precision, but each line seemed to carry weight beyond its text. The audience, she observed, grew increasingly silent as the performance unfolded. She described the moment the lights went out during the final scene as a kind of rupture. When the house lights eventually came back on, the audience had vanished entirely. Doors that should have opened to the lobby now led back to the stage or to windowless corridors. The outside world was gone, replaced with walls that folded back into themselves no matter which direction they walked. There were no sounds from outside. Time no longer followed any pattern. Hours passed in silence. Days followed without food or fatigue. The theater, in her words, had ceased to be a building and had become something else entirely. She wrote that at first the cast believed it was an elaborate trick, perhaps a psychological exercise or part of some immersive experiment. But as the days turned to a strange kind of static endurance, their confidence eroded. One by one, the actors began to vanish. Evelyn never witnessed them leave. She simply awoke or returned to the main hall to find one fewer chair filled one fewer voice in the space. She noted that no one ever screamed. There were no sounds of struggle or fear. The disappearances were quiet, almost ceremonial. She believed they had followed the final instruction in the script and had stepped through the narrative itself. She refused. She stayed behind. Eventually, Evelyn described a shift in the structure of the space. Walls buckled inward. Floors warped under her feet. The lighting grew dimmer until it resembled only memory. She wrote that in the final moment before she fled, the air around her had felt heavy with presence, as though the story itself had turned to look back at her. She did not know how she escaped. One moment, she had been crouched behind the curtain, and the next, she had been crawling out through a rusted door into the basement stairwell. She never returned. She boarded a bus, changed her name, and disappeared. When Lila finished reading the last page of Evelyn's writing, she sat for a long time without moving. The room around her felt ordinary, filled with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whine of a copier. And yet, the story she held in her hands had redrawn the boundaries of what she believed was possible. She did not believe in magic or the supernatural. Her understanding of the world was shaped by evidence and documentation. But what Evelyn described was not magic. It was architecture. It was intention. A script rehearsed with enough precision, believed with enough weight, had the potential to define the space around it. The next morning, Lila returned to the demolition site, now reduced to a field of gravel and rebar. She stood on the edge of the foundation and imagined the hidden room beneath her feet. She thought of the chairs, the table, the black drapes. The undiscovered stage had not survived physically, but the conditions that made it possible still echoed in the fragments left behind. She understood now that the danger had never been the performance itself, but the submission required to complete it. The cast had followed the instructions without question. They had surrendered their presence in pursuit of an artistic ideal that Thomas had framed as truth. Evelyn's refusal to complete the final instruction had spared her. That refusal, Lila believed, was the only real act of escape. The folder that Evelyn had given Lila remained unopened on her desk for 2 full days after their meeting. Not out of neglect, but from a deliberate need to sit with the weight of it. Lila had transcribed the contents of the original journal, annotated every paragraph, and cross-referenced the timeline against known local events. But this second folder was different. Evelyn had said nothing about it during their conversation, only that it should not be read until the first account had settled. When Lila finally opened the cover, she found a clean, organized series of typed pages, each labeled with a date and a title. The first was simply marked Aftermath. The tone in these new pages had changed. The fear that marked the earlier writing had been replaced with resolve, and though the narrative continued to reflect what Evelyn had endured, it no longer read as a confession. It read as a plan. Evelyn began by detailing the early months following her escape. She described long stretches of silence, how she avoided contact with anyone from Bellmare, and how she changed her name using forged documents and took a job under the radar in a small diner outside Keene. For almost 2 years, she kept her head down, moving every few months, never staying long enough to form attachments. But the experience of what had happened did not diminish. She wrote that the silence of the theater had followed her not as a haunting, but as a structure. She believed that the performance had not simply imprisoned the cast, but had constructed a frame that would eventually seek to repeat itself if left unchallenged. She began writing, not just to remember, but to contain. One entry dated March 1981 revealed that Evelyn had returned to Bellmare in secret. She had arrived late at night and approached the theater from the rear, staying hidden in the trees behind the fence line. She never entered the building, but she claimed she could still hear something moving beneath the floorboards. She described the sound as shifting weight, as if chairs were being dragged across a wooden stage in the dark. She left that same night and did not return. But after that visit, she began writing more obsessively. She transcribed the entire version Omega script from memory, line by line, including the final instruction that had never been performed, re-enter, when seen remain when named. She believed that this instruction was a key and that it had been left behind for someone else to find. In 1982, she mailed a letter to Sam Delaney's last known address in Rutland. She did not expect a reply and none came, but she enclosed a summary of her account and asked whoever received the letter to keep it safe. She had reason to believe that Sam had been erased from the public narrative, not just by omission, but through intentional efforts by individuals beyond Bellmare. Her suspicion centered again on Raymond Hollis. She had encountered his name in several academic citations related to performance funding and memory theory, most notably in a private fellowship, known only through internal university correspondence, the Overture Initiative. She believed Hollis had not only observed the play, but had endorsed its development and permitted Thomas to build the undiscovered stage as part of a funded experimental program. Lila paused in her reading to process the name again. Overture Initiative. The same title that had appeared in the burned ledger and that the former councilman had mentioned in passing. Evelyn's letter suggested the initiative was designed not to support performance, but to explore how narrative containment could affect cognition. She referenced a private meeting Thomas had once described where he claimed a story could become permanent if enough people followed it without deviation. It was not magic, it was repetition, control through participation. Lila understood now that the cast had not only performed the story, but had surrendered to it as a structure stronger than fact. Evelyn's later entries became more analytical. She broke down each act of the play into its original version, and the Omega revision noting where the language shifted from observation to instruction. In one act, a character originally questioned the watcher, asking what gave them the right to look. In the revised script, that same character spoke as the watcher, stating, "We see, because you stand still." Evelyn underlined these changes, explaining that Thomas had transformed the play from a question into a declaration, from narrative into doctrine. This, she believed, was the threshold, the moment when performance ceased and the structure closed. By the mid-1980s, Evelyn had settled in Ashby, where she began working as a librarian under her new identity. She kept to herself, but she continued to write filling journals with thoughts on presence memory and the mechanisms of story. She feared that if the script were ever recovered, the conditions of repetition would begin again. In her final pages, she outlined a concept she called secondary ignition. This referred to the moment when someone reopened the closed text and engaged with it not as memory, but as function. She warned that once someone believed the story had more to offer, the loop might begin to form again. Her closing note was addressed to a future reader. "If you have found this," she wrote, "you are already part of the structure. You must choose what to complete and what to leave unfinished." When Lila finished reading, she felt the echo of those words settle over her like a final curtain. She looked around the room, taking in the collection of documents and artifacts she had assembled over months of research. She now understood that every photograph, every ledger, every surviving line of dialogue was not simply evidence. It was participation. She had followed the narrative step by step, moved deeper into its center, and now held the final key Evelyn had left behind. The play had never truly ended because someone always came looking. The only way to break the structure was not to resolve it, but to refuse its closing line. In the final week of October, the air in Bellmare had turned brittle with the slow creep of early frost, and fallen leaves collected along sidewalks like fragments of old pages scattered by wind. Lila moved quietly through the town now, no longer looking for pieces to collect, but instead reviewing the ones she had gathered, trying to determine which among them should be preserved and which ought to be forgotten. The folder Evelyn had given her sat unopened on her desk for days following her last reading, not because she doubted its importance, but because she understood too well what it meant to reopen a closed narrative. Every word inside it was another step into a space that had once collapsed around 10 people who believed they were merely performing. Now, after months of investigation, after journal entries and blood-stained scripts and buried ledgers, Lila knew the line between audience and participant no longer existed. She had crossed it, and now, whether she chose to publish her findings or bury them, she was no longer just a witness. She returned one final time to the edge of the former Maplewood Playhouse, the ground now leveled and dusted with early snow, the foundation filled with gravel and concrete poured over the place where so many had vanished. It looked harmless like any other abandoned project, and yet she could feel the weight of memory beneath her boots. The trees along the back fence stood bare, now limbs stretched like fingers searching for meaning in the sky. She stood there in silence for a long time before finally reaching into her coat pocket and removing the last remaining copy of the Omega script. It had not been rewritten or altered since the day Evelyn had buried it in the woods behind the theater, but it had survived, nonetheless passed from silence into light. Lila had considered burning it, even shredding it and scattering the pieces into the river, but now that moment had arrived, she found she could not act on impulse. The script was dangerous, yes, but it was also a record of choice of obedience, and resistance of belief turned inward until it consumed the self. That evening, she returned to her office and locked the script away, placing it in a box beside Evelyn's journals and the last transcript of the version Omega instructions. She did not shred it. She did not erase it. Instead, she wrote a letter not addressed to any official body, not intended for publication or legal review, but written as a record, a personal account of the investigation compiled with all its ambiguities and supported by the full weight of the documents Evelyn had preserved. In the letter, she explained that the cast had not been abducted, nor had they disappeared by force. They had rehearsed for something they could not name. They had surrendered to a framework that asked them to believe in a story more fully than they believed in their own lives. They had not died in the traditional sense. They had exited. But the performance itself had remained unfinished, hovering in the space between discovery and denial, waiting for someone like her to pick up the script again and ask how it had all begun. A week later, she contacted a small archival press run by a university that specialized in lost narratives and historical theater studies. She submitted her letter as a personal essay with no request for payment and no expectation of audience. She attached copies of Evelyn's writing, the scanned ledger, and select images from the original film reel. She left out the full script. In her cover note, she explained that while the story was real, the risk of revival through full reproduction was too great. What she offered instead was the outline, the context, the caution. She marked the entire submission as historical fiction, not to distort the truth, but to protect it from being reenacted. The editor, after several weeks, responded with a brief acknowledgement and a promise to include the piece in their spring collection. As the seasons turned, Lila returned to her quiet routines. The town of Bellmare slowly reoriented itself around a new construction site where a community center was scheduled to be built. The theater, now erased from architectural memory, became part of local folklore again. Just another story told by older residents to younger ones, with raised eyebrows and lowered voices. But the names of the 10 cast members returned to circulation. Lila worked with the local council to erect a small memorial near the former site of the stage, a simple plaque listing the names in the order they appeared in the original playbill. No mention was made of their disappearance. No speculation offered about their fate. Only the names preserved in bronze accompanied by a single line at the base. We performed to remember not to vanish. Evelyn passed away quietly that winter, her obituary brief and dignified, written under the name she had lived with for over 4 decades. Lila attended the service, standing in the back with hands folded, listening as the small congregation remembered a librarian, a quiet neighbor, a woman who loved books and kept to herself. No mention was made of Maplewood. No one from Bellmare attended except for Lila. She left a single flower at the gravesite and walked away without looking back. Months later, the archival press mailed her a copy of the published volume. Her essay appeared near the end, buried among other curiosities and forgotten scripts. She read it once, cover to cover, noting the footnotes the editor had added to soften the claims and suggest plausible alternatives. But that was expected. It was not meant to convince. It was meant to hold. She placed the book on her shelf and turned off the light. In the years that followed, the story faded again as stories do. People moved on, or they forgot, or they transformed the memory into something more palatable. But Lila knew the truth. She carried it without fear now, not because it no longer mattered, but because it mattered too much to force it into daylight where it could be misused. The lesson Evelyn had left behind remained clear. Not all stories are meant to end with resolution. Some stories are meant to be interrupted. That interruption, that refusal to complete the final act, was not failure. It was survival. And so the play remained unfinished, not because it could not be concluded, but because one person had chosen not to speak the last line, and another had chosen not to print it. That choice made twice was enough to keep the performance from returning. That choice, quiet and invisible, became the final act, one not of applause, but of restraint. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Share your thoughts on the plot in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. We read every message.